In 1967, one of the most respected truck manufacturers in American history quietly closed its doors. Not because their trucks were bad, because they were too good. Diamond T had spent 60 years building vehicles that outlasted their competition, outperformed their specs, and occasionally outclassed the market's willingness to pay for them. The company didn't fail. It was absorbed, erased, and most people under 50 have never heard of it. Context setup. To understand Diamond T, you need to understand what American trucking looked like in the early 1900s. It was a mess. The automobile industry was about 4 minutes old, practically speaking, and commercial vehicles were essentially modified carriages with engines bolted to them. Most manufacturers were building trucks the same way they built wagons, with the assumption that if it moved under its own power, that was good enough. Reliability was an afterthought. Comfort for drivers didn't exist as a concept, and quality control was whatever a guy in a shed decided it was on a given Tuesday. Chicago, 1905. C.A. Tilt was running a shoe manufacturing business. He'd been watching the early truck market the way a mechanic watches someone try to fix an engine with a hammer, with a specific combination of frustration and opportunity. Tilt was a practical man. He believed in making things correctly the first time, and he believed that customers would pay for quality if they could see it, touch it, and depend on it. So he started building trucks. He named the company Diamond T. The diamond came from the diamond logo he'd used in his shoe business, a symbol he associated with quality. The T was for tilt, clean, direct, no nonsense, which turned out to be a pretty accurate description of what Diamond T was going to build for the next 6 decades. The early years weren't glory. They were grunt work, building reputation one truck at a time, one satisfied customer at a time. The vehicles were solid, well engineered by the standards of the era, and they came with something unusual for the period, a genuine commitment to standing behind what they built. If a Diamond T truck broke down, Diamond T cared. That was actually a distinguishing feature in 1905. It sounds like a low bar. It was a low bar. Diamond T cleared it easily and kept building upward. By the 1910s, the company had established a regional reputation in the Midwest. By the 20s, that reputation had spread. Fleet operators, the people who bought trucks in quantity and therefore had a very clear understanding of total cost of ownership, were paying attention. A truck that lasted longer, needed fewer repairs, and kept its resale value wasn't just pleasant to own. It made economic sense, but the real test was coming. And it wasn't going to be about economics, it was going to be about war. Problem statement. Here's the situation the U.S. military faced in 1941. They needed trucks, a lot of trucks. Not just pickup-sized vehicles or light utility rigs. They needed heavy haulers capable of moving artillery, bridging equipment, aircraft fuel, ammunition, and other heavy machinery across terrain that would have destroyed most commercial vehicles. Roads in North Africa weren't roads. Roads in Europe were frequently bombed into rubble. Whatever they built would need to function in conditions that nobody had designed for in peacetime. The problem wasn't motivation. The problem was specification. The Army's requirements for a prime mover, a heavy tractor capable of hauling multi-ton artillery pieces, were, to put it diplomatically, ambitious. The vehicle needed to operate in desert heat, Arctic cold, wet mud, and dry sand. It needed to be maintainable in the field by soldiers who were mechanics by training, but exhausted, under-resourced, and possibly under fire. It needed to be reliable in a context where unreliable meant men died. Several manufacturers took a run at these contracts. Most of them built something that met the specification on paper and struggled in the field. Diamond T took a different approach. They built something that exceeded the specification by a margin that made other manufacturers uncomfortable. Not because Diamond T was trying to show off, but because their engineering culture, by 1941, had spent nearly 4 decades optimizing for one thing: build it right or don't build it at all. The result was the Diamond T Model 969. And it was about to become one of the most important vehicles of World War II. Not the most famous, not the most glamorous, but important in the way that supply lines are always more important than anyone wants to admit until they don't exist. Main narrative. The Model 969 wasn't a tank. It wasn't a combat vehicle in any conventional sense. It was a truck. A big, heavy, powerful, brutally capable truck designed to haul the M19 tank transporter trailer, a lowboy trailer that could carry an M4 Sherman tank or other heavy armored equipment. Think about that for a moment. The Sherman tank weighed roughly 33 tons. The trailer to carry it weighed another 10 or 12 tons on its own. So you're talking about a truck that needed to pull 40-plus tons across roads, and frequently non-roads, in active combat theaters. Diamond T gave the 969 a Hercules DFXE diesel engine, 6 cylinders, producing approximately 185 horsepower. That doesn't sound like a lot by modern standards. In 1942, for a vehicle doing this kind of work, it was serious engineering. The torque figures were what mattered. The engine was tuned for pulling power at low revolutions per minute, which is exactly what you need when you're hauling 40-odd tons through Belgian mud or over temporary bridging in France. The truck had a 4-speed main transmission with a 3-speed auxiliary, effectively giving the driver 12 forward gears and 3 reverse to work with when managing loads that would kill a lesser drivetrain. The cab was, and this surprised people who drove it, comfortable, not car comfortable. But for a military truck of the era, the Diamond T had a level of thought put into the driver's environment that most military vehicles ignored entirely. The reasoning was practical. A driver who isn't exhausted after 2 hours makes better decisions. Better decisions keep trucks and their cargo intact. Diamond T understood that the human operating the machine was part of the machine. Let's talk about what the 969 actually did in the war. The M25 Dragon Wagon combination, that's the Diamond T 969 paired with the M19 trailer, became the standard heavy tank transporter for Allied forces in the European theater. Not the only one, but the standard, the reliable one. The one commanders requested when something important needed to move. Here's why that mattered. Tanks are built for combat. Their tracks and running gear are optimized for battlefield movement, not long-distance road travel. Running a tank 40 miles on its own tracks to reach a battle wears down components, burns fuel at an alarming rate, and arrives at the fight with a crew that's been bouncing around inside a metal box for hours. The tank transporter solved all of that. Load the tank, drive it to the front, unload it, and the tank arrives fresh with a fresh crew. The problem was finding a prime mover reliable enough to do this consistently. The Diamond T was that truck. General George Patton's Third Army made particular use of them during the drive across France in 1944. When Patton needed to move armor quickly, and Patton always needed to move armor quickly, the Diamond T 969 transporters were the enabling technology, not the tank, not the fuel. The truck that moved the tank to where the fuel and the enemy were. The British used them, the French used them, the Soviets received them under Lend-Lease. Post-war analyses of Allied logistics consistently pointed to the heavy transporter fleet as one of the underappreciated factors in the campaign's success. The 969 was built at Diamond T's Chicago facility in numbers that stagger the math a bit. Over 5,000 units between 1941 and 1945. 5,000 trucks, each one built to a standard that the military's own inspectors regularly noted as exceeding requirements. Spoiler: that reputation was going to be both the company's greatest achievement and, in a roundabout way, part of what eventually killed it. But that comes later. Post-war, Diamond T returned to commercial production. And here's where the story gets complicated, because post-war commercial trucking was a very different world than pre-war commercial trucking. The highway system was expanding, interstate freight was growing, trucking companies were scaling up, which meant they were buying in volume, which meant they were more price-sensitive than ever before. The loyal regional customer who bought 2 Diamond T trucks a decade and knew the name was being replaced by fleet managers who bought 50 trucks at a time and evaluated them on cost per mile. Diamond T's response to this environment was to keep building good trucks. Excellent trucks, actually. The Model 920, the 921, the 923, a series of heavy-duty commercial vehicles that carried the same DNA as the wartime 969. Built right. Overbuilt, some argued, priced accordingly. The sales numbers were decent, not spectacular. The competition, White Motor, Mack, Kenworth, Peterbilt, was hitting the market from every angle. And one competitor in particular was about to make Diamond T's life considerably more complicated. White Motor Company had been watching Diamond T for a long time. They'd seen the wartime production numbers, the military reputation, the loyal commercial base. White wanted that, not to compete with it, to own it. The acquisition conversation started in the mid-1950s. Diamond T was still independently owned. C.A. Tilt had long since stepped back, and the company had passed through management transitions that, while professionally competent, perhaps lacked the founder's particular blend of stubbornness and vision. When White Motor came calling with serious money, the resistance wasn't what it might have been in an earlier era. In 1958, White Motor Corporation acquired Diamond T. It didn't immediately kill the brand. White was smart enough to know that Diamond T's name meant something in the market, and they kept producing trucks under the Diamond T nameplate. But the independence was gone. The engineering decisions that had been made in Chicago by people who had spent careers building Diamond T trucks were now made by a larger organization with different priorities. And then, in 1967, White made a decision that effectively ended Diamond T as a distinct entity. They merged Diamond T with another brand they'd acquired, REO Trucks. The resulting company was called Diamond REO. Technically, the Diamond T name survived. Technically, it wasn't Diamond T anymore. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. Okay, back to it. Technical Deep Dive. Let's get into what actually made Diamond T trucks technically distinctive, because the answer is more specific than they were well built. Plenty of manufacturers claim to build well. Diamond T built to a particular engineering philosophy that shows up in the specifications in ways you can actually measure. Start with the 969's frame. The ladder frame, the backbone of any truck, was constructed from heat-treated alloy steel with a section modulus that exceeded the military's minimum specification by roughly 15%. That 15% wasn't there because someone made a mistake in the calculations. It was there because Diamond T's engineers built to actual working loads, not theoretical minimum loads. The military specified what the truck needed to survive. Diamond T specified what the truck needed to do comfortably. The difference sounds semantic. It isn't. A frame built to minimum spec is fine until it encounters conditions that exceed the spec. A frame built to actual working load has margin for the unexpected. The heavier trailer, the washed-out road, the emergency tow that nobody planned for. The cab construction deserves its own paragraph. The 969 used a steel over wood composite structure for the cab, not because it was cheap, but because that combination provided both structural integrity and vibration damping. Pure steel cabs of the era transmitted road noise and vibration directly to the occupants. The composite construction reduced that. Again, practical decision. Driver comfort equals driver performance equals truck reliability. The Hercules DFXE engine. Let's go deeper here. 6 cylinders, 4.3-liter displacement indirect injection diesel, rated at 185 horsepower at 2,000 revolutions per minute. The torque peak, the number that actually matters for a hauler, came in at approximately 550 foot-pounds at 1,200 revolutions per minute. You wanted that torque peak as low in the rev range as possible, because low-speed torque is what gets 40 tons moving from a standing start. The engine was also, relative to the power it produced, forgiving. Forgiving in the sense that it tolerated the kind of maintenance conditions that field service created: imperfect fuel, infrequent oil changes, filters that were cleaned rather than replaced. It wasn't bulletproof. Nothing is bulletproof. But it was robust to neglect in a way that more sophisticated power plants often weren't. The transmission arrangement was the 12-speed setup mentioned earlier, a fuller 4-speed main box with an auxiliary 3-speed behind it. 12 forward ratios gave the driver extremely fine control over the power delivery to the rear axles. On a steep grade with a loaded tank on the trailer, the difference between the right gear and the wrong gear was the difference between making it and not making it. 12 choices meant the driver could almost always find the right one. The rear axle arrangement was a tandem bogie, 2 driven axles spaced close together, distributing the load across 4 contact points rather than 2. This wasn't unique to Diamond T, but their implementation of the walking beam suspension connecting the tandem axle pair was particularly well executed. The walking beam allowed each axle to move somewhat independently over rough terrain, keeping all 4 rear wheels in contact with the ground and therefore providing traction in conditions where a rigid arrangement would have lifted wheels off the surface entirely. Traction in mud, traction on soft ground, traction on the rubble of a bombed European road. That walking beam suspension was the difference between the truck working and the truck being a very expensive obstacle. The front axle was a single steering axle, Timken roller bearing equipped with a kingpin geometry that had been carefully designed to remain manageable under load. Steering a truck this heavy without power steering didn't exist in this application, required the front axle geometry to minimize the effort required at the wheel. Diamond T's engineers got that right. Drivers noted it. Military evaluations noted it. The fuel system is worth mentioning. The 969 carried fuel in 2 tanks with a combined capacity of 150 gallons. Range at typical loads was roughly 500 to 600 miles, adequate for the operational requirements of a theater-level logistics operation, though refueling infrastructure was obviously necessary for extended operations. The electrical system was 24-volt, which was becoming standard for military vehicles because it allowed smaller gauge wiring to carry the same current as 12-volt systems, important when you're trying to keep weight and complexity down. The starting system was accordingly robust. Diesel engines of this era required significant cranking energy to start in cold conditions, and a 24-volt system with adequate battery capacity handled that more reliably than 12-volt alternatives. Now, let's talk about the commercial trucks of the post-war era, because they inherited this same philosophy, and that's where the market story gets interesting. The commercial Diamond T920 series used Cummins diesel engines. The NH series inlined 6 cylinders that were becoming the gold standard for long-haul trucking in America. 220 horsepower in early variants, up to 265 horsepower in later versions. For a heavy commercial truck of the late 1940s and early 50s, that was competitive power with excellent fuel economy by the standards of the time. The frames were, again, overbuilt. A Diamond T frame that left the Chicago factory was rated for loads that most competitors would have spec'd lighter. The suspensions were set up for longevity, spring rates chosen to minimize fatigue on frame members, and body mounts over hundreds of thousands of miles of use. The axles were Spicer and Timken units, the acknowledged quality leaders of the era. The cab-over-engine models that Diamond T introduced in the early 1950s, the Model 923 COE in particular, were notable for the thought put into cab accessibility. The cab tilted forward for engine access, which sounds obvious today, but was actually a significant practical advancement for fleet maintenance at the time. Less time in the shop meant more time on the road, which meant lower cost per mile, which was exactly the number fleet operators cared about. The thing is, this engineering cost money. Not an unreasonable amount of money, but more than the minimum necessary to build a truck that met specifications without exceeding them. And in a market increasingly dominated by volume fleet sales to cost-conscious buyers, that premium, even a justified, economically rational premium, was a growing headwind. Diamond T was selling quality in a market that was starting to price on cost. That tension was always there. In the post-war years, it became structural. Consequences. What happened after White Motor absorbed Diamond T in 1958 is a story that played out over a decade, slowly enough that you might not notice it happening if you weren't paying attention, but fast enough in retrospect that it reads as almost inevitable. White Motor wasn't a bad company. They built decent trucks, they were commercially competent, and they understood the industry, but they were a publicly traded company operating in an increasingly competitive market, and that created pressures that didn't exist when Diamond T was independently owned. The first consequence was standardization. White had multiple brands, White, Diamond T, and eventually REO, among others, and manufacturing efficiency argued for sharing components across brands. That's a sound business decision. It reduced tooling costs, simplified supply chains, and allowed volume purchasing advantages on common parts. It also meant that Diamond T trucks gradually became less Diamond T and more White Motor with a different badge. This is a pattern that repeats throughout industrial history. A brand built on specific engineering choices gets acquired by a larger entity. The larger entity rationalizes components. The engineering choices that made the brand distinctive and which were inseparable from specific decisions about materials, tolerances, and specifications, get averaged out. Not deliberately destroyed, just normalized, economized, brought into line with what makes sense for the larger organization. By the early 1960s, Diamond T trucks were still good vehicles. They weren't bad trucks, but the particular DNA that had made them distinctive, the overbuilt frames, the carefully optimized suspension geometry, the cab design that reflected genuine thought about driver experience, was increasingly diluted by the standardization process. Fleet operators noticed, not immediately and not dramatically, but the word that had traveled for decades that Diamond T trucks were worth the premium because they lasted longer and cost less over their working life. That word started to fade. The Diamond REO merger in 1967 was the symbolic end. It acknowledged openly what had been happening gradually. Diamond T was no longer an independent engineering entity. It was a nameplate, a legacy, a brand identifier on a product that was increasingly defined by someone else's decisions. Diamond REO continued producing trucks through the 1970s. They went bankrupt in 1975. Some assets were acquired, some were liquidated. The name eventually faded even further. The broader trucking industry consequences were, in one sense, unremarkable. The market continued to consolidate, as all mature industrial markets do, and the brands that survived into the modern era, Kenworth, Peterbilt, Mack, Freightliner, did so through their own versions of the same story Diamond T had navigated, with varying outcomes. But there is a specific consequence worth examining. The military application of Diamond T technology, the heavy transporter concept, the Dragon Wagon combination, had a longer life than the brand itself. The M25 Dragon Wagon remained in U.S. military service well into the 1960s, and some remained in inventory even later. Allied nations that had received them under Lend-Lease used them longer still. The engineering decisions made in Chicago in 1941 and 42 were moving military hardware around the world for 30 years. That's a specific kind of legacy. Created it. The human cost, and there is created it. The human cost, and there is always a human cost in these stories, was paid by the people who had built their careers around the Diamond T name. Not in catastrophic layoffs or sudden collapses, but in the slower erosion of identity and purpose that happens when an institution that stood for something specific gradually stops standing for it. The engineers who had optimized those frames and suspension geometries and cab structures retired or moved on. Their institutional knowledge left with them. Nobody was villainous here. White Motor made rational business decisions. Diamond T's owners sold for understandable reasons. The market demanded cost efficiency, and the market got it. The outcome was the disappearance of something that, once gone, couldn't easily be recreated. That's not tragedy exactly, but it's something. Modern relevance. There are Diamond T trucks in museums. The Military Vehicle Preservation Association has documented surviving examples of the 969 prime mover, the wartime version, in collections across the United States and Europe. A few are operational. If you find one at a show and climb up into that cab, you can put your hands on the steering wheel and understand something about the engineering philosophy immediately. The cab isn't cramped. The controls are logically placed. It feels, for a vehicle from 1942, considered, intentional. That feeling is the design. The relevance today is partly historical. If you're studying World War II logistics, you eventually encounter the Dragon Wagon and therefore encounter Diamond T. But it's also structural. The question of what happens to quality brands when they enter large organizations is permanently relevant. It's happening right now in trucks and in software and in manufacturing and in every industry where consolidation is the dominant economic force. The Diamond T story is also a case study in what premium engineering actually requires. Not just better materials or tighter tolerances. A culture. A set of decisions made at every level of the organization that prioritize the right outcome over the minimum acceptable outcome. That culture is fragile in a way that the trucks themselves weren't. The trucks lasted decades. The culture lasted as long as the independents did. There's something specifically relevant to the modern truck market here. The discussion about electric commercial vehicles, autonomous trucking, and the next generation of freight technology is, in some ways, a replay of the early 1900s conversation about transitioning from horse-drawn freight to motor vehicles. New technology creating new requirements, new manufacturers entering with different philosophies, old reputations being tested by new conditions. The companies that will build the best electric trucks aren't necessarily the ones with the most capital or the most engineers. History suggests they'll be the ones with the clearest philosophy about what their vehicle needs to do and the stubbornness to build to that standard even when the market is asking for something cheaper. Diamond T had that for about 50 years. Then it got complicated. The surviving trucks are still out there. There's one fully restored Model 969 at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox, Kentucky. There are others at truck museums in Iowa, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. There's at least one operational example that shows up at military vehicle shows in the mid-Atlantic states with some regularity. If you see one, take a minute with it. It's not flashy. It doesn't need to be. The Diamond T story ends the way most of these stories end, not with an explosion or a dramatic failure, but with a gradual absorption into something larger and less specific. The name survived longer than the substance. The trucks outlasted the company, and the engineering philosophy that built those trucks, build it right, build it to actual working conditions, build it to last, didn't disappear. It dispersed into the industry like salt into water. You can find it if you know what you're tasting. ca. Tilt started building trucks because he believed you could tell the difference between something built correctly and something built adequately. He spent 60 years proving it. The market eventually decided adequate was good enough. It usually does. The Diamond T trucks kept running anyway. Some still are, which was, in a way, the whole point. That's the story of Diamond T, a company that built trucks too good to fail and a brand too specific to survive acquisition intact. If you've got a family connection to Diamond T, grandfather who drove one, father who worked at the plant, uncle who bought one for his fleet, drop it in the comments. Those stories are worth hearing. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. More coming soon.